The UN has appealed for more than £1 billion to provide life-saving assistance to millions of people in Yemen who are facing the threat of famine. Pro-government forces, supported by a Saudi-led coalition, have been battling the rebel Houthi movement since 2015, when its forces overthrew the president and seized the capital, Sana'a. Almost 3.3 million people are now suffering from acute malnutrition, and aid supplies can't be unloaded at Yemen's Red Sea port of Hodeidah after it was bombed by warplanes from the Saudi-led coalition. Our correspondent Nawal Al-Maghafi, one of the few Western journalists who have travelled to Yemen in recent months, has sent this report.
Fatima is the face of hunger in Yemen. In the 6 months since we met her, every day has been a struggle to get food. Her mother says they're barely surviving. Fatima's not alone. There are over 2 million children like her. 90% of Yemen's food is imported, and most of it arrives here, what was once its busiest port. But all the cranes needed to offload the ships have been bombed by the Saudi-led coalition, and the port is barely functioning. The Saudis have imposed an aerial and naval blockade controlling all imports to the country. They say they're stopping arms from getting to the Houthis and their allies, but that means that very little food is getting through. The World Food Programme has bought new cranes for Hodeidah's port, but we've been told that the Saudi coalition has refused to allow them in for at least 2 months.
These delays in bringing foodstuffs on shore, either commercial or humanitarian, means there's less available, and therefore the prices will go up.
From what I've heard is that the Saudi argument, firstly, is that the port is in control of the Houthis. So they're handing over cranes to a port that's under the control of the rebels. They also say that these cranes could be used to offload arms for the rebels and therefore fuel the fight. What would you say to that?
Those cranes are for WFP. Those cranes are brought in and funded for WFP, who are the logistics cluster, to bring those food goods off ships that are coming in. The port's controlled by the same people who've always controlled the port, and the same as the sea offshore is controlled by the Saudi-led coalition. So we just want these cranes in so we can do our work to make sure the humanitarian pipeline is as strong as it can possibly be.
The fighting for control of the port has been going on now for over 6 months, with neither side winning. And it's the most vulnerable that are left suffering. Nawal Al-Maghafi, BBC News.
2 years of war in Yemen have created what the UN has described as the world's largest humanitarian crisis. As well as impending famine, the country is also facing an unprecedented outbreak of cholera. In the past month, 52,000 cases of suspected cholera have been reported, and the World Health Organization believes that figure could rise to 300,000 within 6 months. There have been almost 500 reported deaths in the past month alone. That's 3 times more than during the previous 6 months. Our correspondent Nawal Al-Maghafi has this special report on a devastating new crisis hitting the people of Yemen.
Frail, weak, and fighting for their lives. These are the faces of Yemen's latest crisis. Preying on the weak and hungry. Cholera has rapidly spread throughout the country. This hospital, already crippled by war, is overwhelmed. Badra and her family arrived in the capital after their town was heavily bombed. She hoped her children would be safe in the city, but 2 days after moving here, their lives are at risk again.
The kids went to play, and then they started cleaning the rubbish outside. My son washed his hands, but just after dinner, he got really sick.
Yemen is a country broken by war and hunger. A place where the young and old become the first victims. It's always been poor, but 2 years of fighting has left it unable to cope with this emergency.
The war has meant that everything is deteriorating, especially the health system. There are no medicines, no access to clean water. It's catastrophic.
Outside, the patients keep coming. But without spare beds, they're treated in the courtyard. With over 200 new cases arriving each day to this hospital alone, makeshift tents have been set up to deal with the numbers. Cholera is cheap and easy to treat. But the UN says the delivery of aid has been slowed down by both sides, which means supplies don't reach the people in need. So far, the outbreak has killed over 400 people. Abdul's wife is the latest victim. He buried her here just yesterday. She was so malnourished, her body wasn't able to fight the disease. She was 21 years old.
Her situation deteriorated, so we rushed her to the hospital. They couldn't help her. We took her to another hospital, but by then it was too late. Everything in our life together was so lovely. She was so kind. Our time together was too short.
Abdul was left widowed and his 6-month-old son without a mother. With no peace in sight, Yemen's war will continue to tear families apart. Nawal al-Makhafi, BBC News.
Good evening. An ongoing cholera epidemic, which is sweeping war-ravaged Yemen, is believed to be the largest ever recorded in a single year. In just 3 months since the outbreak started, there have been more than 360,000 suspected cases. Yemen has become a breeding ground for the disease after 2 years of a devastating civil war that has split the country between a Saudi-led government coalition and Iran-backed Houthi rebels. Few communities have been left untouched by the disease, but the worst-hit areas are controlled by Houthi rebels and suffer the most from a blockade of food and aid. Nawal al-Maghafi has had rare access to the area in and around Hajjah province, where the outbreak started. You may find some parts of her report distressing.
Another crisis has hit Yemen. People here question how much more they can take. War and poverty have combined to mean cholera has swept through this country faster than any on record. Unless treated quickly, this waterborne disease can kill. Most have walked hours to get treatment, but only the fortunate make it in time. Samira rushed here from the village to save her daughter. Her family have suffered all 3 tragedies of this war. They've lost their home to an airstrike, the children go without food, and now they're all fighting cholera. Too malnourished to breastfeed, Samira has been feeding her daughter powdered milk with cholera-infected water. More than 7 million people here also face the threat of famine. Cholera costs pennies to treat, but being malnourished makes it much harder for the body to fight the waterborne disease. In another clinic lives Abdullah. For months now, he's had very little food or access to clean water. Aid agencies are doing what they can, but the magnitude of this outbreak is outstripping their ability to respond. 1 person dies in Yemen every hour from cholera.
This is the world's largest humanitarian crisis, and it's completely man-made. Pockets of famine are growing, cholera is spreading, and civil servants like the doctors and nurses here haven't received a salary in over 10 months. There's one thing that people here keep telling me. and it's that they feel completely forgotten by the world. Hospitals here are on the verge of collapse, so schools like this one are being turned into cholera treatment centres. Local businessman Mujahid al-Saudi is funding this place out of his own pocket. 5,000 have been brought here in the 2 months since it opened.
العالم ومجلس الأمن والأمم المتحدة انعدمت الإنسانية فيهم عندما تحدث هذه الكوارث وسببها العدوان والعالم متفرج ولم يصدر منه أي قرار حتى إدانة. ما فيش وسيلة مواصلات سريعة توصل إلى الموقع.
People face the biggest threat in rural areas. In this one village alone, 20 people have died in the space of 3 months. Hours from the nearest town, it was impossible for people without money to get help. Abdullah has recently become sick. Together with his sister Hind, they can't afford the medicine for their illness. It's been over 2 years since this conflict began, and people here are sick, hungry, and exhausted by this war. Abdullah and Hind are 2 out of 5 people in their family that have been infected with cholera, and the nearest hospital is over an hour and a half away. And like most people here, they simply can't afford to get there. The truth is that for many in this country, there's no escaping cholera. Here on the edge of the village is the only source of water. The people know it's infected, but with no other options, they continue to rely on it. Nawal al-Makhafi, BBC News, Hajjah, Yemen.
Well, with me is our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins. James, some of the images in that report were almost unbearable to watch. How has it come to this in Yemen?
This does look like a war without pity. The UN's coordinator for humanitarian aid in Yemen has said that neither side has shown any interest in the fate of civilians, contrary to the laws of war. And the two sides are broadly the Yemeni government, backed by the military firepower of Saudi Arabia, leading a coalition on its side, and the Houthi rebels supported by Iran. And that's important because, in effect, this means that a war is being fought in Yemen, a sort of proxy war between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran. Now, the International Committee of the Red Cross says almost 19 million people are reliant on aid. That's significant because the Saudi coalition has bombed in the past the largest port, the most important port in Yemen, vital for food and medical supplies, and they haven't allowed in replacement cranes.
And what is the international community doing?
The international community, frankly, has found itself almost ineffective. Some people say unwilling, actually, to intervene sufficiently. Go back 2 years, the UN Security Council, including the key powers, Britain, France, the United States, authorised the Saudi military coalition to go in on the government side, believing that would shorten the war. Instead, frankly, they've been dismayed by what's happened, and they have not been able to stop it. We have shocking civilian casualties. The Saudi coalition has killed the largest number in Yemen, even if the other side has also been guilty of killing many civilians. The Saudis insist that their past airstrikes on hospitals were not deliberate, that they were accidents, and that they've done a lot to try to sort that out. And of course, we know that Britain's controversial arms sales to Saudi Arabia have recently been upheld as legal by a High Court judgment. But frankly, there's no end to this war in sight. Instead, it's slipping deeper and deeper into cholera and to famine.
James, thank you. Good evening. We've a special report tonight on the devastating human cost of a war that has been raging in a remote corner of the Middle East for 2 years. The UN is calling it the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with the country on the brink of famine. Yemen is split by a fierce civil war between the internationally recognised government, backed by a Saudi-led coalition, and Houthi rebels allied with Iran. Yemen has become a breeding ground for disease. Cholera has swept the country, with nearly 2,000 deaths since the outbreak began in April. Access for international journalists is very rare, but our Middle East correspondent Orla Guerin, with her producer Nicola Karim and cameraman Nico Hamian, have got in. They sent this report from Aden, and a warning: there are distressing images throughout.
We crossed the Red Sea to reach Yemen, past the sunken wreckage of a hidden war. This was the only way to the port city of Aden. The Saudi-led coalition, which is bombing the country, grounded the UN plane due to fly us in. And this is the kind of suffering they don't want the world to see. Rassam El-Wasabi is 11. He's one of many children wasting away across the country. Since the war, malnutrition rates have soared. Hunger is menacing this nation, from the very old to the very young. Like Hussein Mazen Hussein, his mother showed us how he fights for every breath. The United Nations says an entire generation is being starved and crippled, and famine is looming. And in a ward nearby, a desperate rush to save Abdullah Mohammed Salam, who came in with no pulse. They tried to squeeze fluid and life back into his veins. He's a victim of an epidemic ravaging Yemen, cholera, and it's the worst outbreak in the world. There's now a perfect breeding ground for disease because sanitation services have broken down. Abdullah's son, Ahmed, has a message for those in power who are busy waging war. Deal with the sewage, he says, and clean the streets. Mosquitoes and flies are everywhere, causing illness. We are demanding that everyone who claims to be our leader should just care about the people. Instead, they are dying of cholera at the rate of about 1 every hour, another outcome of a brutal conflict. This hospital alone receives about 100 new cholera cases every day. Those who get help recover quickly, within hours. But many in Yemen are dying needlessly because they can't get the most basic treatment. After more than 2 years of war, half the health facilities in the country aren't functioning. Like much else in the Arab world's poorest nation, in the streets of Aden, scars of battle. The Presidential Guard mans checkpoints here, but the Yemeni president is seldom in the country. He was forced to flee by Houthi rebels. That's when his allies, the Saudis, stepped in. Their bombing campaign has not restored his authority. But it has destroyed hospitals, schools and homes like that of the Awal family. Their house was hit by 2 airstrikes as the coalition targeted Houthi fighters nearby. Sanad Awal tells us 2 years on, the extended family of 30 are among the forgotten victims of this war. Some of the family still live right here in the ruins, with no help, they say, except from God. But civilians here have been under fire from both sides. We met Adol and her children waiting for food aid. 10-year-old Imad used to love football before he was hit by a Houthi shell. I brought the kids into the house, she told us, and asked them to stay inside. They went into the living room, and that's where they were hit. He lost both legs immediately. Since then, she says, Imad and her other children have never been the same. They have deep psychological wounds, as well as physical ones. Most of all, it is Yemen's children, like 10-month-old Ahmed, who are paying the price here. The conflict has reached a stalemate. International diplomacy has failed, and nowhere in the world are more lives at stake. Orla Gearan, BBC News, Aden.
Well, our diplomatic editor James Landale is here. James, how has it come to this in Yemen?
This is an entirely man-made crisis. There was a government in Yemen. It was weak, but it was legitimate. The Houthi minority felt marginalised, so they led an uprising. They overthrew the government. This worried the Saudis. They feared Shia-led insurgency in their backyard, so they formed this military coalition to try and reinstate the government. They got the support of the United Nations to do it. But after 2 years of fighting, there is a military stalemate, so the bombing continues and the suffering continues.
Is there any sign of an end to this? What's the international community doing?
There's very little hope indeed at the moment. The UN has repeatedly failed to achieve any kind of ceasefire. And other events make it, I think, much harder. Iran has come in on the side of the Houthis, which means this is now seen as a proxy conflict between Sunni Saudi Arabia and Shia Iran. Saudi Arabia has been emboldened by the support of Donald Trump. They don't feel under much pressure internationally to reduce the bombing, despite the criticism by some who say that international humanitarian law has been breached. And I think also the diplomatic standoff between Qatar and other Gulf states means that international attention is focused not on Yemen but away.
What's the British government's position in all this?
The UK is involved in some of the diplomatic efforts in the United Nations, but there's MPs accuse it of having a contradictory position here. On the one hand, the UK supports the Saudi-led coalition. It also controversially sells Saudi Arabia arms, some of which are used in this conflict. But on the other hand, the government is also spending £140 million a year on foreign aid on the ground in Yemen, trying to pick up the pieces. So it's a pretty uncomfortable policy with tensions in the British government.
James, thank you. Police in... Good evening. We start with a special report tonight on the desperate crisis in Yemen and the ongoing suffering of its people. In two leaked reports obtained by the BBC, the UN accuses both sides in the war there of killing and maiming children and says the Saudi-led coalition is blocking the delivery of food and medicine. Yemen is now in its third year of war, which has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis. 17 million people don't know where their next meal is coming from, and 7 million more are facing famine. The war is between a Saudi-led coalition which supports the government. It includes many of the Gulf states and is backed by the US and the UK. On the other side, Houthi rebels with some support from Iran. Nawal al-Maghafi's report is from the Houthi-held area of Hodeidah. Her report contains distressing images.
Many of Yemen's children have only ever known war. And Hodeidah's central hospital is full of them, victims of a conflict that has left their country battered, broken and starving. I first met Dr. Abdullah Zuhairi a year ago. He tells me things are now much worse.
We have started to see so many more cases of malnutrition. Now, it's not only the poor bring their children here, we are seeing cases of severely malnourished children from middle-class families too.
He takes me to meet Ala, just 3 years old. His immune system is failing. He needs intensive care, but there are no beds available. His family stay by his side. As we talk, the doctor interrupts us. A bed has been freed and Ala is rushed to intensive care. This is one of the area's last functioning hospitals, but it's on the brink.
All these people have spent all the money they have to get this far. Now the electricity is off. So all the machines are off, all the incubators are off, all the oxygen has stopped. And this happens all the time.
The war between the Saudi-backed government and the Houthi rebels is now in its third year. The region's richest nation bombing its poorest. It's killed thousands and left millions homeless. We head across town. Wherever you go, displaced people line the streets. With all borders closed, there's no escape. Even the refugee camp offered no protection for Mohammed and his family. Hodeidah is Yemen's main port city. It should be a lifeline, but now it's barely operating after the Saudi coalition bombed the cranes and blocked their replacements.
And food should not be a weapon of war. Food should be a weapon of peace. 95% of all the food that we need to feed the innocent people comes through this port. If this port is bombed and completely made useless, literally hundreds of thousands of children will die and millions of people will die along with it.
But it's not just starvation that the war is causing. Yemen now faces the worst cholera outbreak the world has seen in decades. 13-year-old Yahya caught it along with 18 members of his family.
والكوليرا من جنب وسوء التغذية من جنب آخر. الماء اللي يشربوه، طريقة المعيشة حقهم. يعني الحياة صعبة جدا. أنا لما أجلس أنا أسألهم الماء كيف الأكل كيف الشرب كيف يعني حالات مأساوية.
In the intensive care unit, we get a desperate call from Ala's mum. He's taken a turn for the worse. We arrive, but it's too late.
ما قهر، نحن نموت. لما يموت طفل عندنا ونحن جالسين الآن تصوري مستلمينه من الصبح نشتغل عليه من دوبامين من شغل من أطباء من وفجأة يعني مش قادر تنقذه بشيء.
As his father says goodbye, the family asks us to carry on filming, to show the world these heartbreaking images. A 3-year-old boy, starved and broken. Another child, born into a war that has now taken his life. Nawal al-Makhafi, BBC News, Yemen.
Well, our Middle East editor, Jeremy Byrne, is here. Jeremy, those images are just distressing beyond words, and the scale of the suffering in Yemen is hard to comprehend.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrendous, and I've got some figures actually about that area, Hodeidah, where that report was filmed, which I've got the figures from Save the Children, who are very busy in that part of town, so they've got that place, so they've got a lot of information. It's one of the areas hardest hit by cholera and malnutrition. In that area, Hodeidah, 27% of under 5s have malnutrition, and almost 94,880, they say, are at imminent risk of death from starvation. And don't forget as well that malnourished children are 3 times more likely to die from cholera than otherwise healthy children. So, you know, the figures are terrible.
And we heard the UN representative there pointing the finger of blame at the Saudis, who are obviously leading a coalition for, amongst other things, blockading the port, stopping food and medicine coming in. The Saudis see it very differently, though.
Yes, and they will also point to, you know, in that leaked UN report, there were information there about grave violations carried out by Houthis as well, including recruiting child soldiers. But the Saudis see the Houthis very much as tools of Iran. When all this started, I sat with a senior Saudi diplomat, and he said, we are going into Yemen and we're going to sort this out once and for all. We cannot have the Iranians active on our doorstep. Now, there are many analysts who say the Iranians are not as active as the Saudis say, but that is the big motivation why they're there.
Of course, the UK is involved. It is supporting the Saudi-led coalition.
Yes, Britain over the years has done some absolutely massive arms deals with the Saudis, and we continue to maintain as well through various contracts some of their equipment. And so, yeah, we're a major supplier. Britain's a major supplier to the Saudi armed forces and the Air Force, and the Air Force has carried out a lot of the killings, according to this UN information, of children in the area, these grave violations as they're called. And now there's pressure inside the UN and from other players outside as well to say that this Saudi-led coalition, which is all the countries in it are strong allies of the West, including Britain, that they should be put, the pressure says, on a blacklist of countries that carry out grave violations of human rights against kids particularly.
Jeremy Byrne, thank you. At least 30 people have been killed following an airstrike on the outskirts of Yemen's capital, Sana'a. Houthi rebels who control the capital say the attack was carried out by the coalition led by Saudi Arabia. The UN Refugee Agency in Yemen has accused both sides of maiming and killing children. Saudi-led forces have been fighting the Houthis for more than 2 years. Thousands of people have been killed, and Yemen is in the grip of a cholera epidemic and threatened with widespread famine. Here's our Middle East editor, Jeremy Bowen.
The attack on the hotel left another ruin in a devastated country and dozens more dead. It will also be seized on by those who believe the Saudi-led coalition selects its targets without regard for civilian lives. Safeguarding non-combatants is the legal obligation of any belligerent in a war. The war has created what is now the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Disease has swept through Yemen. More than 500,000 have contracted cholera. The UN estimates 80% of the population needs humanitarian assistance. More than 1 million under fives are acutely malnourished. The current conflict in Yemen started in March 2015 when a coalition led by Saudi Arabia intervened in a civil war. The declared aim was to restore the internationally recognized government. It had been thrown out of Sana'a, the capital, by an alliance of Houthis, a powerful family from the north, and forces loyal to Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president. He once said that governing Yemen was like dancing on the heads of snakes. But the Saudi move was also a message to Iran, its rival across the Gulf, to keep out of its backyard. The Iranians have given some help to the Houthis, though most likely less than the Saudis claimed. All sides in the war have contributed to the disaster in Yemen. War crimes, the UN has said, have happened with alarming frequency. But Yemen's food crisis, which is starving millions, has been made much worse by the blockade imposed by the Saudi-led coalition. Earlier this year, cranes in the port of Hodeidah were destroyed by Saudi-led airstrikes, paralyzing docks which the UN had been using to import food aid. This week in the capital, Sana'a, tension has been rising. The ruling alliance between the Houthis and former President Saleh is fracturing. Both sides are preparing for big rallies tomorrow. A new intensification of the war will only deepen Yemen's man-made disaster. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News.
The United Nations says airstrikes in Yemen by the Saudi-led coalition have killed more than 40 civilians in the past week, including many children. The latest hit a residential neighbourhood in the capital, Sana'a, killing at least 12 people, women and children among them, and sparking more international condemnation. Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, is now in its third year of war. 17 million people are struggling to feed themselves. 7 million more are facing famine. The war is between a Saudi-led coalition backed by the US and UK, which supports the government, and the Houthi rebels, who have some support from Iran. Nawal Al-Maghafi reports.
Another ruined building in Yemen's battered capital. This is what's left of an apartment block in Sana'a. Amongst the rubble, bodies of dead children. The pictures, too distressing to show. This man says civilian homes are always targeted. Local people are convinced the attack was from a Saudi coalition airstrike. Today, the coalition has responded and said it will investigate these reports. We were in the same neighborhood just 2 weeks ago when we met 9-year-old Najud. You could hear the sound of coalition fighter jets. She told us they hit everywhere and how she and her family have been living in fear. Stop the war, she told me then. But today, another tragedy has struck just a few streets away from her home. Tensions have been rising. Wednesday's attack on a hotel has now led to a call from the UN for an independent investigation. More than 30 were killed here. The Saudi-led coalition said they were targeting armed Houthi militants who they've been fighting in this brutal war. But aid agencies on the ground in Yemen say they're increasingly concerned about what they call the blatant disregard for civilian lives.
The high cost paid by civilians in terms of deaths and casualties is unimaginable. And that comes in a situation where the war sees no sign of ending, and we see the lack of political progress. And therefore people see this as this is the new normal for people here in Sana'a.
The war, now in its third year, has crippled Yemen. Disease has spread. More than 500,000 people here have cholera, and a quarter of the population are on the brink of famine. This war has created what's now being called the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And with the failure of international diplomacy and the growing threat to civilians, there's no end in sight for the people of Yemen. Nawal Al-Magafi, BBC News.